Good morning. If you like, you can turn over to Exodus chapter 1. We'll read from Exodus 2 and we'll kind of reference Exodus 1. But as you make your way there, did anyone ever struggle with scary dreams and nightmares as a kid? Just go ahead and raise your hand if you ever had some nightmares, scary dreams. Raise your hand if you ever had a recurring dream. Anyone have that? There are more hands for that. That doesn't make sense. I had one that was kind of a repetitive dream. This happened a lot when I was maybe 6 or 7, somewhere around that age. I was in the middle of this army that encircled me. It was really random, but that's how dreams are, right? It was just in the middle of this army that encircled me. And then they would start chanting. And the chants would get louder and louder and louder, and then the circle would get closer and closer and closer, and then eventually I would wake up. Right before they got to me, I'd wake up. Weird dreams. Here's what I remember about all of those nightmares, all the dreams that I had as a kid. When I would wake up from a dream like that or any other nightmare, I would wake up, I would startle awake, and my eyes would be met with the darkness, and I knew every time that all I had to do was cry out, "Daddy, Daddy," and right there, boom, my dad would show up. Now, by the time I was 15 years old, I finally outgrew that. But I knew I could cry out for him. And here's the other thing, interesting about the recurring dream. I always had that dream, and when I would wake up, I would always be sick. I don't know if there's some kind of correlation with that, but I always had that dream, and I would wake up sick. And I knew that in the darkness, I could cry out for my dad. He would come, and this is a little graphic, but I would be in the bathroom, stomach churning, chucking up whatever was in there, and here's why I bring that up. This is a sweet story. My dad would have his hand right on my back, and he would say, "I'm right here." I don't know what else you say when someone's in that situation, but it is helpful to hear the words of your father say, "I'm right here. It's okay, I'm right here." I knew that about my dad. When I was in the darkness, I could cry out, and he would be right there. I want to use Exodus 1 and 2 to kind of meditate on that thought of God being with us in the darkness. And before we actually read from there, I want to read this quote and just get your reaction to it. This is from C.S. Lewis. He says, "Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." What do you think about that quote? I think it's pretty powerful. I think there's something so true about each of these things. First of all, that God speaks to us, or whispers to us rather, in the pleasures of life, right? When we see a beautiful sunset, when we have this view atop some mountain, or the joy of a friendship or a good meal, whatever it might be, we experience these joys of life, and it's like these little whispers from God. Have you ever sensed that? These little whispers from God that give us this sense of gratitude and thankfulness, knowing that he's there. And not only does he whisper to us in the pleasure, but he says he speaks to us in our consciences. Aren't there those moments when it feels like something other than your own willpower pulls you toward what is right? Maybe especially after a Bible study or reading scripture or a sermon, there's something that pulls on your heart in a unique way. And in some real sense, it's like It's like God is speaking to us in those moments, a reminder that I'm right here. I'm right here. And so God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our consciences. But according to Lewis, the loudest and clearest that we hear the voice of God is when he shouts to us in our pain. He describes it as that megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And we see that all throughout Scripture, right? Especially in the prophets. God uses these means of discipline to draw the people back to him, to call their attention and to bring them back. And I like the way that Lawrence put it a few weeks ago. God's discipline is not to pay them back, but to bring them back or to win them back. And whether the pain and the suffering that we experience is directly associated with our sin or not, in whatever particular case it might be, there's something so true about pain and suffering being a means through which we draw nearer to God. There's something about the humility, the dependence, the need that it creates in us, that if we see it in the right way, pulls us nearer to him, to hear that voice. But while I think that statement is powerful and true in many ways, that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, and shouts to us in our pain, I also know that it doesn't always feel that way. In fact, sometimes it doesn't seem like God is really there at all, that we don't hear his voice whisper, speak, or shout to us in any particular situation, and it feels instead like we're crying out in the darkness, and all we can hear is the echo of our own voice that reverberates in our mind and just reinforces that isolation and separation and distance that we might feel. And we begin to wonder all these questions, like, where is God in all of this? And does he really care? And if he does care, why isn't he doing anything about this? Or maybe this, does he even see me at all? And it's all these questions that I think Israel is asking here in chapters 1 and 2. Where is God? In chapter 1, if you want to just reference that, in chapter 1 we read about how Israel became fruitful and multiplied, and they became strong in echo all the way back to Genesis 1, to be fruitful and multiply. Well, that's now what Israel is doing. They have the favor and the blessing of God, and as they grow and expand in this nation, eventually a Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph and who doesn't know Yahweh God. And as a result, he enforces this harsh labor on them. And as they begin the back-breaking task of making bricks and doing the hard labor out in the fields, Pharaoh thinks that this is what will limit the population from growing and overtaking us, from then becoming too powerful. But they still grow. And they still become strong. And so Pharaoh comes up with another solution. And he says, all right, every male child will be put to death. And he makes this decree. And after some time, he finds that Israel is still growing stronger and stronger. And so finally, he demands that every male child be thrown into the Nile River, thinking that this will finally put a limit on this slave nation. And at this point in the story, in Exodus 1 and 2, God has yet to make an appearance. And think about that. Now, there is a slight allusion to him being with the midwives who reject the decree of Pharaoh and still help out the Hebrew children. And yet, after these 400 years, still no direct evidence that God is still holding faithful on his promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, all those many generations ago. And don't you know they're wondering all those same questions? Right? As they are crying out in the darkness, where's God? And why isn't he doing anything? And does he really even see us at all? Which is interesting because the word see actually comes up a lot in these first two chapters. Jochebed, Moses' mother, Jochebed saw that Moses was good. She saw that Moses was good, that there was something unique about him, something beautiful about him. Miriam saw Moses at a distance when he was left in the basket and floated down the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter saw Moses in the ark and saw that the baby was crying. Moses saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, and it says that Moses saw there was no one to intervene, and so he took action. And over again in these two chapters, we hear that word, saw. Someone saw something, and then as a consequence, they did something. And so he strikes the Egyptian. Stephen in the New Testament says that supposing God would bring about salvation through his action, which is interesting. Stephen's interpretation of what Moses was doing in this moment. But still, after this supposed act of deliverance by Moses, there's still no sign from God. And he's forced to flee into the desert and escape punishment for his crime, going to a place where he'll be unseen. And since the narrative has yet to introduce Yahweh, it seems like all of this emphasis on seeing that comes up over and over again is a way of setting up the reader to ask the question, what about God? What about God? As all of these different characters are seeing something, as they're seeing the oppression, and as they're seeing perhaps ways to intervene and to bring about this deliverance, it raises the question in our minds, does God see? Does he see what's going on in this moment? And if he does, then what is he going to do about it? Or what is he doing about it right now? And either way, it all leads to verse 23 of chapter 2, which says this. Exodus 2:23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And then verse 25, God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So all this time, all these 400 years as Israel is crying out in the darkness, God saw. God saw the suffering as they had become slaves. He heard the cries of the people, and he knew. And that word knew can mean a lot, but it seems like in this moment in verse 25, what it's saying is God knew it was time. That as the cries of the people enslaved in Egypt finally ascended up to God, after all these 400 years, as everything was put just in place, God knew it was time. And so at just the right time, God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt, and they became the children of God en route to their inheritance in the promised land. And at this point in the story, there's still so much to be explored, but you know the rest of the story. You know how it unfolds. But as we come to the table this morning, I want us to make a sharp pivot toward the New Testament, toward another time, toward a time when after another 400 years of slavery, this time not just to Egypt, but to 4 different nations, Israel still experienced the silence of God, the darkness, not hearing his voice. And after those 400 years, at just the right time, God sent another deliverer into the world. And here's how it's talked about in Galatians 4, beginning in verse 1. Paul says this, Galatians 4 and verse 1, he says, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. But he's under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. So what Paul's doing right here is he's making the case that Israel was like a child that needed these guardrails to grow up and to become who God intended them to be all along. But then he says this in verse 3. He says, in the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And so you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Can you hear the echoes of Exodus in those verses? Though we were slaves, he says, to the elementary principles of this world, to the principalities and powers of evil and darkness, though we were once enslaved to sin and to death, at just the right time, when everything was set in place, God sent forth his son to redeem the world from our own slavery to sin and to become the children of God. And I love verse 6. Because you are sons and daughters, he says, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So 2 things I want us to see before we partake. Number 1, when it seems like our cries go unanswered, God is often working behind the scenes. That's the story of the Exodus, right? That when everything seemed to be falling apart, when nothing seemed to be going the right way other than Israel being fruitful and multiplying and just creating more slaves for this oppressive empire, just when everything seemed to be going the wrong way, behind the scenes, everything was just the way it was supposed to be. It was all part of the plan. And sometimes that is all we need to take the next step forward when we feel like we're in the darkness, feeling our way through. Knowing that even though I can't see what's going on, I can trust that behind the scenes, God's got a plan. And that he's going to bring that plan to fruition at just the right time. But the other thing is this, that because we've received adoption as sons and daughters, we can cry out, Abba, Father, and know that he's right there. We can cry out in the darkness. When we're awakened not to some dream, to some nightmare in our own imagination, but to the reality of a world that has somehow gone so wrong, we can be awakened within that darkness to know that we can cry out, Abba, Father, and he's going to be right there. And he will come to our aid. and that he hears us and he sees us. And maybe that won't always be in some powerful, miraculous sort of way that's so palpable and evident to us right before our eyes. But here's what I grew up to realize. That eventually I didn't have to call out every night for my dad. I didn't have to cry out in the darkness for him to come to my aid, because I knew that he was just down the hall. And simply his presence, simply his nearness was enough for me to trust and know that if I need him, he's going to be right there. And so this morning, let us remember what God has done to prove that he's with us, that he sees us in the darkness. And as we meditate on what God has done through Christ by the power of the Spirit, let us hear that voice. Let's hear the voice of God sometimes whisper, sometimes speak, and sometimes shout, I'm right here. I'm right here. And we can cry out to him saying, Abba, Father. How deep is the Father's love for us? We'll now ask the men to come forward as we partake this morning.